My name is Kent Beck. I'm a programmer coach at Facebook. And when I got the invitation to come speak, I asked questions about, well, what would you be interested in hearing about? Oh, just to tell us some stories about extreme programming. So I thought, no, no, really, what does the audience want to hear about? Well, just tell some stories about extreme programming. So since I didn't get a decent answer to that question, I'm going to tell you some stories about extreme programming. Um, it is a little sobering to think that this is 20 years later that the the evolution of an idea would take that long. As a young programmer just coming out of college, I would never have believed that anything could last that long at all, much less that that's just the beginning of a trajectory of a set of ideas. So um, I can appreciate the timescales now, and especially when I compare what we're doing to what's happened in the lean manufacturing world, where the timescales are more like 50 years. 20 years is a blink of an eye, just not if you're raising children. So um, here's the outline. Now, the primary rule of storytelling is always do things in threes. So I didn't do that. I figured I'd break the talk into to two sections. The first one is, and I'm glad that I saw another one in the previous talk, is just a timeline. What happened over those 20 years, and a little bit of prehistory as well. And then I'm going to do something that I'm very suspicious of as an audience member. This kind of lessons learned, which usually strikes me as a heavy with rationalization, kind of aren't I smart to have figured all of this out? And then you sprinkle in some, well, here's what I would do differently, proving that I'm even smarter now than I was before. So I'm always very suspicious of that, but I'm going to give it a try and we'll see what happens. So um, here's the here's a timeline of my experience with extreme programming. Now, if you have questions about any of this, I'm going to leave some time at the end. Feel free to ask them. I'm going to give you the short versions of all of these stories or skip some of them altogether. So my experience with programming methodologies started the first day of classes as a computer science student at the University of Oregon. The head of the department in the very first class stood up and gave a lecture about structured top-down programming, where programmers of the future will take a concise, precise definition of the problem and break it down into code in such great detail and discipline that in the career of a programmer of the future, you might be able to point to 4 or 5 errors that you made ever. And I walked out of that lecture aghast. I'm 18 years old. I've been programming for probably 6 or 8 years at that point, and I just thought, this cannot be the future. This doesn't sound like any fun. I'm going to change the way that people do that. Now, that seems pretty arrogant for an 18-year-old to say something like that. And since then, I can reassure you, I've gotten even older. But that's really where it started. I knew that I was looking for something different than what was out there. My first job coming out of school, I was lucky enough to use a programming language called Smalltalk, which was very different than the other languages that were available at that time. I was able to experience programming as a learning experience. It's not a production. It's not sitting there and cranking out widgets. It was a learning experience, an exploratory experience, an intensely creative act, something that was intellectually and emotionally absorbing, something that was a profoundly social experience as well. And that gave me a hint of what it was that I wanted to encourage on a much larger scale. Small talk was great for two people sitting at a computer. It had troubles, though, scaling up. At some point there, I went independent as a consultant, and I began to recognize the value of automated tests in the programming experience. I was going to a client in Chicago, and I can remember I knew this was like on a Sunday, midday Sunday. I'm thinking I have to fly out, and I'm going to tell them that they need to write automated tests. But I don't know how to tell them to write the tests. So before my plane leaves, could I come up with a tool that would let programmers write tests in a way that programmers are familiar with, capable of using? And 2 or 3 hours later, I had the very first version of this XUnit framework, which has now been copied and used by lots of people all over the place. And took it to the clients, and in good consultants fashion said, so you guys need to write some tests, and of course here's how you do it. And they said, oh, we use this tool? Yes, this is a tool. Okay, we'll use this tool. You know, yeah, absolutely. So it gave me another lesson in the value of confidence, having invented it, 12 hours before that. And it was at about that time, once I got used to having automated tests, that I remembered a book that I'd read as a kid. My dad was a programmer too. Grew up in the Silicon Valley, geek brat. My dad brought home calculators and stuff for me to play with. He'd bring home books about programming, and so I read this book. It said, here's how you write programs. You take the input tape. Now, when I'm speaking to younger programmers, I have to explain that an input tape is like a long, thin floppy disk, and a floppy disk is like a spinning solid state. Anyway, but you guys get this. It said you take this input tape and you type in the output tape that you expect this to create. This is when IT was a tape-to-tape activity, and you'd have these long strings of programs, and each program would convert some input into some output, and then that would be fed into the next program. So you take a concrete input tape, you type the output tape that you expect, and then you program until when you feed the input tape through the program, you get exactly the matching output tape that you expected. So I had this shiny new testing framework, and I thought, let's see. So if I wanted to follow that same model, the first thing I would do is not write a program and then write a test for it. I would write a test for this program that doesn't even exist yet. Now, this is a stupid idea, right? Clearly, you know the test is going to fail. It won't even compile because you haven't even written the program yet. So how useful could that be? So following my usual strategy, if an idea is really stupid, it's definitely worth trying. If an idea is good and it turns out to be true, somebody else will have done it. If an idea is stupid, you have a chance that nobody else is dumb enough to try it. Then if it happens to work, you really have something. Oh, how do you think of these great ideas? It's because they're not great ideas when I think of them. Seems straightforward. So anyway, I thought, okay, so I remembered this computer book that I'd read. I used to read the books my dad would bring home. I'd just read them over and over, and I didn't understand anything. I was that kind of kid, which you may not have encountered before. But I thought, well, let me just try it. So I just tried it with a stack as my first example. Push, pop, push two things, pop two. And I'd write one little test. I'd make it work. I wrote the next test. I'd only programmed just enough to make the next test work, and the next one, and the next one. And I thought, I can't think of any more tests that could possibly fail. And it was like cheating. That moment, that heroic moment as a programmer when things are about to get out of control, and then through the sheer force of your intellect and your will, you pull order out of chaos, that moment was gone. Instead, I just said, now the program needs to do this. Okay, it does it, and it needs to do that, and it does it, and it needs to do that, and it does it, and it needs to do that. And by implication, I can't think of any other inputs that would cause this program to break. Oh, okay. So that's how TDD, test-driven development, this odd style came about for me. In 1996, March of 96, I was invited to a project at Chrysler called C3. It was a year 2000 project to replace a very complicated payroll system. Payroll is a simple problem until you get employees, unions, and governments involved, at which point it's no longer a simple problem. They had some performance problems with they were trying to use Smalltalk derived technology, which wasn't very mature at that time, and they had some performance problems. So I got there and I said, well, where are the tests? By this time I was a testing guy. Where are the tests that will prove when I make things go faster that I haven't broken anything? And they said, actually, the code doesn't really work yet. And I said, I can make it go really fast if it doesn't need to work. And they didn't think that was funny, kind of like you guys just now. And so I realized very quickly that there was more going on here. And I found myself at the end of the week in the office of Sue Unger, who was then the CIO of Chrysler. So by far the most powerful person that I'd ever talked to face to face. And I said, Sue, you got three options that I can see. You can keep going like you're going. This is a 2-year project that had been 6 months from shipping for a year and a half. Yeah, you've been on that one too. So you can keep going and nobody's happy about that. You can just cancel the project and outsource this or find somebody else to do it. I said, I think that's a shame because you have some very good people here who really understand the problem that they're trying to solve. Or you can give everybody a week off and throw all the code away and start over, and I think you'll be successful. And she said, I'll take option 3 and you're in charge. I said, you don't understand, I'm a consultant, I don't do in charge. She said, you don't understand, I'm Sue Unger, the CIO of Chrysler, you're in charge. When I got on the airplane to fly home that night, my hands were shaking so bad I could not drink my whiskey. What have I gotten myself into? And then I realized, hey, I'm in an absolute no-lose situation. I'm going to get paid to do this. If it's a failure, it was already a failure. If it's a success, I'm a hero. So I don't have anything to lose. So I went back, and this is the birth of extreme programming. I went back to the team a week later. Everybody had a week's vacation, and they really needed it. And being Americans, I sat down with the project manager. I said, okay, well, introduce yourself. Tell me what you do on the project, and then I'll tell you how the project's going to run. So he said, okay, my name is Steve. I'm the project manager, and I do this and this and this. He said, okay, so how's this project going to run? And I said, okay. So we're going to structure the project in 3-week increments. And at the end of 3 weeks, we will have we'll have implemented a few more stories, and we'll have a demo for the users, and then show them the progress we've made. And then in the next 3 weeks, we'll implement some more stories. I said, oh, okay, that sounds good. Next person comes in. Introductions, how's this project going to run? I said, so we got these 3-week increments, and we'll implement some stories in each one, and each story will have some acceptance tests that'll prove that this story's been completed. Oh, okay. Next person comes in. Hi, I'm so-and-so. I said, okay, so we got these 3-week increments, and we got the stories and the tests, and we're going to do this pair programming stuff. Oh, okay. By the end of the day, I had formulated extreme programming. It was completely improvised, but carefully prepared. Inspiration is a preparation plus panic. And neither alone is sufficient. But when you put them together in just the right moments, I'd taken everything that I'd learned about people writing software together and explained, okay, here's how we're going to write software. Now, many of the decisions that I made in the heat of the moment that seemed so insane to me, like having running software every 3 weeks, that's passé now. There's no way anybody would iterate that slowly at this point. I hope it didn't just offend anyone that didn't need offending. But the basics were really there. That was the structure, that the software was always going to be running, that we would measure progress by how much more of the input we could run correctly, but we could always do something. We would always be working end to end. And that was really the birth of extreme programming. And I have my notebooks where I was trying to figure out the name for it, and there it is, April something or other, extreme programming, because I would tell my friends about, okay, well, I'm running this big IT project, and it's crazy, and there's got these iterations, and oh, that sounds good. And I got tired of saying this, the way we run this project, so I had to give it a name, and that's what I came up. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but that's that. Another milestone on my learning about software development was the development of JUnit. So I'd written this testing framework in one language, and then we moved to Switzerland in '97. And my friend Eric Gamma and I were flying to a conference back in the States. I wanted to learn Java, which was brand new stuff at that time, and he wanted to learn about the testing stuff. So I said, well, let's build this testing framework in Java, and because we're programmers, we're going to write tests for the testing framework in itself as we go along. So we're going to develop this framework one test at a time, all the while the whole thing's testing itself. It's a kind of a macho thing to do on an airplane. And by the time we landed, though, we had the first version of JUnit. And fortunately, my friend Martin Fowler was at the conference, and we handed it to him. It was just like 2 guys for 4 hours on an airplane until the batteries ran out, right? How important. But we gave it to Martin, and Martin came back and said, this is fantastic. Other people need to see this, and JUnit spread from there. And then that architecture's been copied many, many different times. Something that goes on with JUnit that I think people miss is the extent to which it's a political statement. It's not a piece of technology primarily. As a piece of technology, most programmers could write the equivalent functionality in a few hours. But making the political statement, as a programmer, I accept responsibility for the quality of my work, at that time was a revolution. And so JUnit, yeah, it's this little framework, but much more importantly, It's a symbol of the acceptance of responsibility. There's not, okay, I'm a programmer and I've made it good enough, and now I'll give it to the QA people who will make sure that it's really good enough, which it's not yet. It says, no, I'm the programmer, I'm responsible for the quality of what I'm doing. And that was really a revolution at that time. And it's a piece of that of JUnit philosophy that I think is kind of missing. While we were living in Switzerland, I wrote the first edition of Extreme Programming Explained, mostly on the train between Zurich and Munich. Turns out that's a really good stretch of railway to write to, because I could just kind of stare out the window, type, let my thoughts flow. There was interesting stuff outside, but not so interesting. And so I'd get a couple of hours in, and most of the first draft of it was actually written on that train. So that was a very popular book by technical book standards when it came out, which is a little like saying a very skilled football club by American standards. But it did shake things up a bit to say all this stuff around programming that's taken on such importance, this document and this phase and that meeting. At the end of the day, you have a program or you don't have a program. And if something you're doing supports the program, then it's worth keeping. And if it doesn't, it's worth considering dropping it. And that mind shift was tectonic for some people. To me, it just made perfect sense, and I didn't understand why everybody wasn't already working that way, and I still feel that same way. But that's my problem, not any of yours. 2 years later, I was flying to an extreme programming conference, and I don't remember who recommended the book, but I had a copy of Toyota Production System. And I can keenly remember being seated in business class, flying transatlantic, and opening this book up. And it wasn't very many minutes before I sounded like someone at a religious revival meeting. Oh, yeah. Uh-huh. Oh, yeah. And the entire business class section is staring at me. I'm oblivious. I sort of registered their reactions, but not so much. By the way, the same thing happened last night in the restaurant when I was telling this story. But the resonance of these ideas to my experience, just thinking of overproduction as a problem, rocked my world. And the water level metaphor, I've used that so many times. That absolutely fundamentally changed the way I was thinking and the way I explained extreme programming. A little bit later, I was visiting a client in Seattle, and the CFO was in the meeting. So it was a kind of a startup kind of environment, 100 sort of people, and they were having problems, and they wanted to try some of this extreme programming stuff. And the CFO is sitting in the corner. The entire morning, 3 hours, glare, arms folded, goes off to lunch. He comes back with a huge smile. He almost hugs me, this being America, not France, and said, "Why didn't you tell me that this was lean for software?" Well, I kind of didn't know that. He said, "I was at Boeing during the transition to lean manufacturing at Boeing. I watched that transformation, and that's exactly what we need here." That was an emphasis to me, like, oh, yeah, there really is a deep connection between what I'm doing and the lean manufacturing world. And that's when I began to take that really seriously. There's the Agile Manifesto, which was a meeting of 17 privileged white guys in a ski resort in Utah. I can't tell you any stories about that because I was extremely sick. I was taking some very powerful antibiotics, and I was just in a daze the entire time. Fortunately, however, my name begins with a B. So the publication is called Beck et al. But that's about the extent of my responsibility for the contents of that. In 95 or 96, we were asked to update Extreme Programming. It had been a successful book. They wanted a second edition of it. And I handed a copy to my wife, Cynthia, who's here today, and said, would you look through this? I knew that she'd worked her way through college grading English papers. And when it came back to me, there were 2 pages out of 160. 2 pages that didn't have a wash of ink on them. Comments, this needs to change, how can you say this? If I'd known this was in the original book, I wouldn't have let you publish it. And so we began a process where we rewrote the entire thing from scratch. There's 2 pages, this driving metaphor, where you don't just point the car in the direction that it goes, you're constantly making adjustments. That one's remained consistent between the 2 editions, but the rest of it we completely rewrote, and we rewrote it together. There's a big shift in tone with the second edition. The first edition is very programmer-centric, and I'm still prone to being programmer-centric. But it was snotty, disrespectful towards the other people involved. Okay, there's programmers, and there's some other people, overhead, that you have to have in order to get paid to program. But they don't matter that much. Users, sure, users, but programmers and users. And then the rest of it is something. Who cares? Don't need them. And shockingly, that alienated a large number of people. Most people who write checks actually get alienated when you tell them that their job's redundant. So that wasn't a good business move, one of many that I could recount in my career. But that was a complete rewrite with the intention of being much more inclusive. Okay, who needs to be involved to create value with software, and how can they be involved in a positive way? Then in 2011, I joined Facebook, and that's the beginning of a story that I won't even tell you here. I've been there for 4.5 years. I coach programmers. After 3 weeks at Facebook, I decided to forget everything I knew about software development because it was so completely different. Either they were morons or I was. Turns out I was. I had so much to learn. So I relearned software engineering from scratch, and 4.5 years later, I'm just beginning to be able to explain the method behind the apparent madness there. But I'm not going to get into that. That's a story for another day. One of the lessons I've learned at Facebook is always to be informed by data. That no matter what I'm doing, I can find ways to gather data that will help me make decisions. So this is, I tried to, the word fad came up, I think, in the morning keynote. So I just wanted to show you the graph of a fad. So this is interest in extreme programming. The time axis is to scale here. But about 97, 98, the first part of the data is from the Google Ngrams mentions in literature data. And the second part of it is Google Trends, which measures the frequency of searches. So, and unfortunately, neither of them cover the whole time span. So that gives you an idea of what it looks like. There was this huge surge of interest in XP, not vertical. It built, but once it hit a peak, then it's rapidly fallen off to background radiation. So that's what it looks like when you have a successful idea, or at least this one in this particular case. Okay, so there's the timeline of extreme programming. Starts with my experience saying, hey, people really do need to change the way they do this, because this isn't going to be any fun or very effective, through to today. Now, here comes the self-congratulatory rationalization lessons learned slide. What would I do again? Thing one, this is absolutely derived from experience. The best compliment extreme programming ever got is someone said, it matches the behavior of programmers in the wild. I thought, okay. Some programmers are more effective, some less. If you look at the programmers who are really effective, they're doing something kind of like this. So I thought, okay, I would definitely derive what I do from experience. When I went to explain extreme programming, I explained it on 3 levels. A value system of communication, simplicity, feedback, courage, and respect. A set of principles like incremental improvement, principle of flow, as I would call it now, and a set of practices that are derived from those principles. And I've found that to be pretty effective to get away from the staring dog problem. You know the staring dog problem? If you try to point something out to your dog is going to look at your finger. You say, no, it's the rabbit's over there, and the dog just looks completely fixedly at your finger. If you explain an idea in terms of practices, concrete, test-driven development, pair programming, continuous integration, people will fixate on the practices and they'll stop thinking. And I've found that this values, principles, practices triad is a not infallible, but a reasonably effective way of communicating the intent behind ideas and not just have people follow things simply. Something else that I would certainly do again is idealism. I would rather start with exactly what I want to see, back off from there to something practical, and then make incremental progress towards the ideal, then start where I am today and make things 5% better. Because I run the risk of making them 5% better in the wrong direction. I run the risk of not making them 20% better when I could, if I just thought of, well, what is it that I really want? I want the software always to be running. Oh, well, can we do that? How close can we do that? Well, we could do that once every 3 weeks. Okay. Turns out we can do that every day. Oh, okay. Turns out you can actually do that every couple of hours. Oh. And as experiences gathered, people are more and more able to have running software as the base state of a project, not this impossible goal as the seconds tick away towards some deadline that somebody made for some reason a long time ago. Now, there are some things I would definitely do differently. The name has been a big impediment. Extreme programming, I wished that I had a better name at the time. I was faced with a very difficult set of constraints. I had no resources, I had no money to brand, so I needed something that would be catchy. I needed a name that Grady Booch would never say he was going to do. That was actually my criteria. And I wanted it to be something that was accurate, and that's the best I came up with at the time. And it's been a positive in some ways, but it's definitely had its costs. The wrong kind of people were attracted to extreme programming in the early days. People who were looking for an escape from responsibility instead of a path to responsibility. And the name played a definite part in that. I would have changed the tone from the beginning. I look at that first edition and I just cringe that I would have written stuff like that. Yeah, it's kind of a manifesto, and a manifesto needs to be emotional, but I don't think you have to be a jackass about it. So, um, and scope. Now, this is a tricky one because I'm a programmer and I see the world through programmer flavored lenses. That's a jet lag kind of metaphor. I would like to. So, what Eric Ries, for example, has done with lean startups is, I think, the more appropriate scope for something like extreme programming, to take it all the way to the customer and cycles of learning for everybody, not focus so much on the programmers. So what am I doing about this now? Uh, I'm continuing quantitative studies. One of the great things about working at Facebook is there's a lot of very smart programmers who leave behind these breadcrumbs of their development activities. So, for example, when I was trying to explain that we get along almost entirely without estimates for tasks at Facebook, I was quickly able to discover that 1.5% of all tasks have a due date set. And I just make a habit of asking and answering questions quantitatively now. Like, does the programming language have an effect on the size of uh, diffs? You know, you submit some change to the code, that's a diff. So a more verbose programming language should cause larger diffs, right? Doesn't. But I love just being able to dig into some data and say, oh, well, this would make perfect sense. What does the data say? Oh, I'm stupid again. That's great. The most exciting words an engineer can say is, it turns out. I'm also expanding the scope of what I'm doing. One of the persistent frustrations with extreme programming was that people like to play the scope card, the scaling card. Oh, well, that might be okay for small teams, but big teams, big projects, you can't do that. I work at Facebook now. Ha! Nobody can play the scale card on me. The scope, the number of uh, eventual end users involved, the amount of data involved, the number of programmers involved. Projects can get very big very quickly at Facebook, and looking at how to continue that is an ongoing process for me. And I'm also working on continuing my work on programming tools to further scale programming processes. I think there's some missing fruit in code review. There's missing tools in configuration management, in merging, that the programmers could do a much better job with a little bit better tooling. So I continue my efforts along those lines, along with my one-on-one coaching of individual high potential programmers, and the challenge, which I really haven't figured out yet, of coaching coaches to do a better job of coaching. I'm trying to obsolete myself and finding myself very frustrated at my inability to teach what it is I do to other people. So that's what I do. That's the history of extreme programming, and I would like to thank you all very much for your time and attention here today. It's cocktail time, but there might be time for a question or two before we start that. I'll let somebody else make that decision so I don't get run over on your way out.
We have questions, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thank you. It's easy to summarize. And the poster's in my office. It says, nothing at Facebook is someone else's problem. That's it. That's the whole thing. Now, how do you get 13,000 people now? It was 2,000 people when I joined. 13,000 people to take that poster seriously when they're providing an essential service for 1.5 billion people every month. That's the hard part. And that's what I'm trying to explain. But there's a culture of personal responsibility at Facebook that's just still, I can't believe it until my wife tells me that Messenger's broke again and I have to go file a task for that. Because I do. Because nothing at Facebook is somebody else's problem. So it's typical for people will post and say, oh, the iPhone app has been crashing for me. I'm going to use the stable app the more stable app that we send out to regular customers, because I just can't have it crashing on me all the time because I'm trying to get work done. And the first time you say that, you will be treated to clear and direct feedback that part of your responsibility at Facebook is making sure the bugs get caught before they get to people. And if that's painful for you, go fix it. And some people don't like that and they leave. And some people love it and they thrive.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.